Let the record reflect the meeting is reconvened with all members present. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. Welcome all. With a short turnaround between meetings, we have no minutes for approval. We'll be on the next agenda, so we'll go right to my greeting. So a few things going on. I want to mention that last Monday morning I had a chance to swear in Kings Road 5th grader PJ Giglio as mayor of Junior Achievement BizTown. It's a program offered by Junior Achievement and sponsored by Madison's Quest Diagnostics. Students got to learn firsthand about how businesses operate. Some of them served as CEOs of various businesses, including Quest Diagnostics, and they were CFOs in the room and other positions. So it was great to see this program, 5th graders. It was piloted last year by Junior Achievement and is growing in leaps and bounds. And if you want to see a picture of a future mayor, on NJ.com, you'll see the picture of right after I swore in. PJ was shaking hands, and he's looking much more mayorally than I am with his tie and with a big smile. So it was a great event to be at. This past Saturday was trail days across the country, encouraging people to take to the trails, so to speak. And we had our Madison version at 1 o'clock, where we met at the MRC, and Stephen Stockert got to show off his great work he's been doing there. And if you hadn't had a chance, please check it out. We now have a fence to keep the deer out so we can reestablish a more natural state in that area. And then in the morning prior to that was seeing our newest county park, Geralda Farms Park. And this is giving the public access to Geraldine Dodge's beautiful estate for the first time virtually ever. And this was supported by Chatham Township Open Space. Morris County Open Space is their largest grant ever given. And New Jersey Green Acres, along with support of Normandy Partners, who was the contract seller of the property, the Kirby Foundation and Dodge Foundation. And on a nice day, please take advantage of it. It is a beautiful walk. And as I said to Mayor Platt of Harding, this is about the only time a mayor can tell someone to go take a hike. So... recognizing some great achievement from our high school, our track and field all-conference winners. We have Helene Rowland, first team, Rose Suriello, first team, Sydney Strelick, second team, Helen Anderson, second team, and Megan Timmons, honorable mention. So congratulations to their success. And if you checked RoseNet or saw it posted in many places, Madison has been named 24th small town most livable community. And that's number 1 in the state of New Jersey, Princeton being the only other town in New Jersey to make the top 100. And so as I don't think there's any high school students in the crowd right now, but those watching on TV, when you're trying to decide whether to go to Drew University or Princeton University, I think we know where you should go now. And one of the things they described as how they judge these towns is their quote on the site says, "These cities and towns allow for the tight-knit communities, key to small-town living, coupled with the amenities that you expect in larger cities." And that sounds a lot like Madison. We've got that community spirit we see on May Day, and we've got what we see at Drew University, access to New York City and everything, and the culture arts puts us right up with any great city. And the Employee of the Month for June is Sandra Emmerich of the Finance Department for her commitment and dedication in learning the many policies and procedures involved with her new position in payroll processing while simultaneously training her replacement in accounts payable. And happy anniversary to Dominic Renzulli of the DPW, 30th year. So if you see him out there working hard, please congratulate him, 30 years of working for the borough. And on to reports from committees. Community Affairs, Ms. Bailey.
Oh, thank you, Mayor. The Madison Chamber of Commerce is holding its awards dinner tomorrow night, June 9th, 6 p.m., Madison Hotel. And the Madison and Chatham Chamber of Commerce are holding their monthly business networking meeting Tuesday, June 9th, 8 a.m. at Charlie Brown Steakhouse at 522 Southern Boulevard, Chatham. The hanging baskets in town are up courtesy of the Downtown Development Commission and the Garden Club of Madison. Also, funds from May Day have expanded the program. And last Thursday was the opening of the Farmers Market. We have our Farmers Market on Thursdays, 2 to 7 p.m. in a new location, Central Avenue between Main Street and Cook Avenue. And this week, they will begin live music at the market from 4:30 to 6:30 p.m. And also, we will be having Saturday sidewalk sounds, courtesy of the DDC. And we will have Friday concerts sponsored by the Museum of Early Trades and Crafts. The Downtown Development Commission and the Madison Arts and Cultural Alliance Sidewalk Gallery banners will be going up this Wednesday. Check them out. They're beautiful pieces of artwork. And Bottle Hill Day applications will be going out this week. Save the date, Saturday, October 3rd for Bottle Hill Day. Thank you.
Thank you. Public Safety, Mr. Catanello.
Thank you very much, Mayor. On Friday, May 29th, the Madison Fire Department had 10 Madison High School students participate in the high school's Day of Service program. The students helped firefighters clean ladders, wash trucks, and were given lessons about fire safety. They were also given the opportunity to try on firefighter gear and go through the department's confidence course, which I'm not sure if you've ever had the chance to actually see the confidence course, but even if I weren't such a large mammal, I would not want to do it. They're a little claustrophobic to begin with. Their help and assistance was greatly appreciated. Also, on Saturday, May 30th, on the afternoon, the fire department had a wet down and rededication ceremony for Geraldine, our 1921 Aaron's Fox fire truck that was originally gifted to the Borough of Madison by Mrs. Geraldine Dodge after a fire on her estate on July 22nd, 1920, had destroyed one of her stables and killed 5 of her horses. The wet down was attended by over 300 people, as well as some antique fire apparatus from neighboring towns. Evidently, a good time was had by all, including my little kids. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Utilities, Ms. Vitale.
Well, believe it or not, I do not have any reports.
Oh. Want to double check your notes? No, sorry. Moving right along, Finance and Borough Clerk, Mr. Landrigan.
No report.
Health, Mr. Wolkowitz.
Yes, I have a report. Not terribly long, though, but I do have a report. As I told you all before, our health department from time to time offers screening clinics, various topics. There are 2 on the roster right now. One I had mentioned before, it'll be taking place on Thursday, June 11th, starting at 8 a.m., and that's the one regarding heart health. Among other things, there'll be analysis of your total cholesterol, HDL, and LDL, and I would just say if you don't know what your numbers are, you should go to this clinic. You do need to call up in advance, so please call the health department if you're interested in attending. There is also one scheduled for June 15th regarding men's cancer screening. That one seems to have gotten people's attention because at this moment it's full up. But they are taking names for a wait list. So if you're interested in that one, again, please call. That one will begin in the evening at 6 p.m. As I mentioned, the one regarding heart health begins at 8 a.m. One other thing I just actually found out this week that isn't so much a part of a report, but something I thought to share, if only because this is the kind of information that can easily be turned around into something it isn't. But one of the responsibilities of health departments in the state of New Jersey is to actively monitor people who may potentially have communicable diseases. And it gets pretty frightening when I tell you that we've been monitoring 2 potential Ebola people and one with Lassa fever. So it sounds like this is very scary. But the reality is that anyone who has been to a place where a communicable disease outbreak has taken place is put on this list. So one of the people went to Sierra Leone, for example. And when you come back, you're immediately watched by your local health department, and watching means you have to speak to them twice a day, take your temperature, report any fever, unusual symptoms. Happy to say The two Ebola clients are asymptomatic, as is the Lassa fever person. But if you happen to hear that we're monitoring potential Ebola people, just know what this means. If you're anywhere within sight of Ebola, you get on the list. Doesn't mean you have it. Fortunately, these people do not. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you. And Public Works and Engineering, Mr. Rowe.
A few quick things. First, on the Public Works Department, something I should have mentioned at the last meeting, but just to remind everyone, Madison has resumed twice-a-week garbage collections for the summer months. From the Engineering Department, the 2015 sewer main lining bids will be open this coming week on June 11th. And finally, tonight on the consent agenda, we have a resolution for resurfacing Noe and Woodland, the portion of Woodland that is north of Lewanika to the Borough border. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
You. Communications and petitions.
None received, Mayor.
Now, this is the first of two invitations for discussion from the public. This is restricted to items on our discussion agenda and also any resolutions that are listed. You will see that there are no ordinances for hearing because we had less than 2 weeks in between, so we'll have all the ordinances that were introduced at the last meeting at our June 22nd meeting. Our items on the agenda discussion include the Civic Center property, 28 Walnut Street, redevelopment, and also our budget guidelines. So you may comment on those two, or, as mentioned, the resolutions. We are, just so the public knows, we are working to set another neighborhood meeting for the Walnut Street redevelopment, and right now we are looking at a week from tonight at 6 p.m. We just need to confirm things, and we'll get that word out as much as possible, and that will be a more informal give and take and ability to ask many questions. But what I will do tonight, because I do see some neighbors that it's tough for you to comment on anything before the presentation, so I'll reopen the invitation for discussion right after the presentation, and you can ask some questions or comment, but it won't be the more informal that we'll have on the 15th. So with that, anyone wishing to comment? Yes.
Could I also ask if we are allowed to do the same thing for the budget guidelines in case anybody in the audience wants to address us after that?
Okay, that's, might as well. We'll, summertime, it's almost summertime. We'll stretch the rules.
Instead of making them wait
yes.
to the end of the meeting.
Yep.
Thank you.
So we'll do the same. So if you see those two items, we'll allow you to do it afterwards, which is not typical. Anyone wishing to comment on those items or resolutions, please step forward. Seeing none, I close this part of the meeting, and we'll go to the redevelopment proposals. And Jim Bruno, we'll start with Jim Bruno, please, and then we'll bring up.
Good evening, everyone. I've reported before to you on, what's happening as a result of the New Jersey Supreme Court case in March regarding affordable housing. And as I mentioned, it's left all municipalities in a state of uncertainty as to what to do. That case set a window of June 8th, which is today, through July 8th, for municipalities, if they choose to do so, to file a declaratory judgment action for the purposes of seeking a court order that says that you're in compliance with your constitutional obligation to provide a realistic opportunity for affordable housing within your municipality. Now, I don't want to get into the pros and cons, if we're filed, when we're filed. We talked about that before, but that's not the purpose of this tonight. But by way of update, we do want to let you know that what the court did say in their opinion is that in any of these court cases, that interested parties have the right to participate in a proceeding. Now, interested parties are those people who were named in the Supreme Court decision or anybody who notifies the municipality that they want to be included. And so what we have now, there's interested parties in this whole debate are a lot of home builders. And they are now sending out letters to all municipalities, and I know that Madison has received at least one that says that I want to be included. Because if the court determines that you're not in compliance with your constitutional obligation, the court could grant to a builder a builder's remedy, it's called, which essentially allows them to develop a project that doesn't have an affordable housing component, and that would supersede your zoning ordinance. They could come in and say, we don't care what your zoning ordinance says, and the court could only do this if they find you have not met your obligation. The court could say you have not met your obligation, and therefore this area should be zoned to allow for dense development, which would include an affordable housing component. So that's what you could face if you're not in compliance. Now, there will be a lot of litigation over the next many months as to what your number should be. And everybody's lining up already as to figuring out what everybody's number should be, and there's a big disparity. But the one thing we do know is that Madison will have a number, and it's important for Madison to plan for, as I said before, to do the best you can to provide affordable housing. So the Civic Center project was one that was designed to try to maximize the yield on affordable housing. The one thing that the Civic Center project would do, if it's approved, and I know there's a lot of other considerations that go into it, but if it is approved, would provide 40 units of affordable housing, and because of the rules, could get up to 53 credits for that because it's in an area in need of real rehabilitation. So it would go a long way towards showing good faith efforts, and Madison has always shown good faith efforts, but you never know what a court will do, so it's best to do the best you can, as I say. So with that by way of background, we do have the presentation by RPM regarding the Civic Center development. And again, there's a lot of considerations. This would just be a first step if they are conditionally designated. We'd have to come to a deal that makes sense to the borough as well as to them and makes it economically feasible. But this would be the first step so that we can engage in negotiations to see if we could make this deal work in a way that benefits everyone. So again, I did want to bring you up to date in the developments in the court proceedings, because there are builders out there this is an opportunity for them to get into towns and to build things that otherwise the zoning wouldn't allow. And so if doors open in any municipality, including Madison, they're going to look to go through it. So again, we have to do the best we can with what we have.
Any questions for Jim before Bob?
When you say that they could come in and build anything they want, let's say, we looked at a particular site and our zoning board or whatever says, it's good for maybe 40 or 60.
Mm-hmm.
How much more could they conceivably put on there? I mean, how much leeway would they have?
Well, again, it would all start with the determination that we have not provided a realistic opportunity, and then there would be some number associated with that. And, it could go up to, I think you're looking at, well in excess of 10 units an acre. That could be even much higher than that.
Okay, and do they also have more leeway in terms of the fit and finish of the property as opposed to what we would normally do, like the appearance?
Oh, no, this is just a numbers issue. What the density would be. The planning board would still have jurisdiction over, what it looks like.
Okay.
Certainly, but to the extent you have design characteristics that could be seen by the court as an artificial way to decrease, otherwise, what a density otherwise would be. So that would be the fight you would be in. But again, it all starts with a court saying you haven't provided a realistic opportunity. And if they say your number is way off, they could really up the number on the builder's remedy.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Any other questions? And just so for people that have not been here before, Jim Bruno is our attorney who has been working on redevelopment, such as Green Village Road School in this project, and also our expert on COA and our obligation. So thank you, Jim. All right, now we'll call up our team from RPM to do a presentation.
Thank you, Mayor, members of council. Should I face this way to the audience? Mayor?
Yep. And to the camera, too, which is good.
So good evening, everyone. My name is Ed Martoglio, and I'm the president and one of the founders of RPM. And two of my colleagues are here, too, Joe Portelli and Rich Martoglio, and they're the ones that are responsible for the presentation. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes, and mainly I'm going to show you some pictures. We're real proud of the work we've done over the past 25 years. All the photos you're going to see throughout the presentation are buildings that were done by RPM over the years. So the firm was founded more than 25 years ago. We're based in Montclair. We only work in the state of New Jersey, but we work pretty much all over the entire state. Since our founding, we've been quite fortunate in that we've been designated by the State Housing Agency to be the recipient of the Governor's Award for Housing Excellence on seven separate occasions. This first photo is a historic rehab. This was a vacant building in Woodbury in Gloucester Township. It was on the National Historic Register. It was rehabilitated into ground-level stores and about 58 apartments for seniors. So one of the ways that RPM operates is that we are diversified in how we run our company. So we have a development division, a construction division, and a management division. So development, like these two young folks here, they go out and they identify sites that have good potential. They work with the municipality and coming up with a plan that is appropriate. We, unlike what Mr. Bruno mentioned, there are builders out there that are involved in litigation with towns. That hasn't been our practice. Our practice has been to, as a matter of fact, we've never been in litigation with a town over our 25-plus years. Our approach is to try and find a solution that can work for the town. So on the development side, we identify the sites, and then we work with a variety of state and federal and local sources so we can bring enough funding to the table to build a really good project. Our construction team manages the construction process, and we're what are called lead builders. So we work under the LEED program, which is a national certification for both environmental and sustainable construction and design. And we've had the ability to complete, there are a variety of levels, LEED Platinum being the highest level of certification. And we've done well in excess of a dozen buildings that are LEED Platinum over the past several years. And then probably most importantly to you folks, in addition to getting a good quality building, is we are the managers. So every building we've constructed over the years, we have an ownership interest and we manage. So we manage for compliance with the tax credit program, which makes sure that the folks that are the residents there comply with all the income guidelines, which are critical to the funding stream. But also we maintain so that the property accomplishes two goals. One is that it's really a home and a quality home for the residents, but also it's a community asset. So with that said, I think I'm going to take you to now, some photos of some of the projects we've completed in recent years. This is out in Franklin Township in Somerset County, and I show this to kind of focus on the importance we have for design. So we do a variety of designs: modern design, traditional design. The first building was a historic rehab, but this is to show kind of a contemporary design. This is a affordable housing complex with ground level retail. It's right on Route 27 in Franklin Township. This is a more traditional design, also a LEED Platinum building. This was completed about 4 years ago. Again, a more traditional design. This is Borough Commons, also in Franklin Township. The reason I show the first few projects from Franklin Township, that was a town some 5 or 6 years ago that was facing a builder's remedy lawsuit. That's the action where a home builder comes in and seeks to increase density, and the way they do that is they propose X number of market units. So that say you have a site that is zoned for two-family houses, and they could come in and say they want to build 200 housing units, and they'll agree to designate 20% of the units or so for affordable. That's what's called a builder's remedy. Also in that same community, these are in fact two-family houses. This is an interesting project. So we do urban and suburban type towns. This is in the city of Newark. And we joint ventured with a nonprofit, New Community Corp., one of Newark's oldest and largest nonprofit organizations. And it was their land that we built on, and we built them a community center that serves a variety of needs. It's an immigration center, it's a workforce center, and it does some health planning too. community, the outdoor garden up on top of this Roseville Commons in Newark. And then one of the other things we like to do is we focus on interior design too. So, you know, these are multifamily buildings, but we want them to be homes that are that the residents can feel proud of. So we pay a lot of attention to interior design. Well, this is on our Springfield Commons building. It's kind of odd, but that's the lobby. Interior kitchens, and we try and do a nice work on the finish. Most of our buildings have hardwood floors in the living space, tiled backsplash. Another lobby. This is in a different center down in South Jersey. Again, another kitchen. All of our buildings have some kind of community room, so that we, as part of the Affordable Housing Tax Credit Program, which is the predominant program that we build under, we provide a variety of services to the residents. Some after-school programs, some health and wellness, sometimes yoga classes, some after-school tutoring, that kind of thing. But this is a beautiful old historic mansion renovation just from last year. It's the old Ballantyne Mansion in the Forest Hills section of Newark. This building had been vacant for 25 years. That's pretty much our story. So we're a group of about 130 of us now at RPM, and we're delighted to have this opportunity to work with the township. We don't have anything about the particular site. We've had some discussions about it, but our focus tonight is to introduce ourselves to the community. We will be present at the community meeting and happy to address any questions or comments you might have. Mayor?
Council, any questions or comments? Pat?
Maybe you could talk a little bit about how do you fund this? I mean, we're going to be contributing some money from our COA fund or our Affordable Housing Fund, and then you fund this 100% yourself, or you get grants from?
We work under a variety of programs. In this particular case, the major funding source is the State Housing Agency. That's New Jersey Housing and Mortgage Finance Agency. And every year they have a competitive cycle for tax credits. And tax credits are really the major vehicle for funding. And we compete with those along with other folks. And there's a cycle coming up this summer, and then there'll be another one the following year.
Do you have to compete every year to get tax credits for this building? Or
No, just it's a one-time award.
And how long do they last for? Or is it just for the building of it?
The way the credits work is that there's an annual award of credits over a 10-year period. We'll bring in an investor, a bank often are usually the ones who come in as our limited partner investor, and in exchange for the annual tax credits, they'll make an equity contribution to the partnership. That typically funds about 70% of the project cost.
And then you manage the building in perpetuity?
That's correct. We're the general partner,
Okay.
and then we're also the managing agent too.
You don't build it and roll it over to somebody else?
We haven't sold any of our tax credit projects over the years,
Thank
and
you.
that, again, that's 25 plus years.
Thank you.
Any other questions from the council? All right, for the public, for those that attended the public session, this will be a little different than that, where we had a very informal give and take. Here, you can step forward. You'll have 3 minutes to, you can share your thoughts or ask questions. If you ask questions, we'll track the questions. We'll answer them all at once, not go in between. So we'll just capture the questions and call it back up if we need to. Anyone in the public wishing to comment or ask questions, please step forward, state your name, your address, and write the same on the clipboard. Chris?
Good evening. My name is Chris Kellogg. I live on Walnut Street. So I just have some questions and I guess some comments. One question is for the process here that the borough has undertaken. It seems to a number of us that the process was a little undemocratic, that the methods that were used, I guess, to redevelop or designate as a redevelopment were not shared with the neighborhood. certainly I was not made aware of it or in any way. And it seems like with a development that undertakes this level of sophistication and density, that it would have been a little more democratic and just sort of, community-oriented if we had been brought in as the neighborhood, and perhaps even the whole town really should have been brought in as some sort of town hall kind of format where we had an opportunity to kind of bounce things around a little bit and talk about the implications borough-wide and not just see this thing sort of last minute stuffed into the convenient corner at the Civic Center. The other well, there's a lot of issues here, and didn't really write everything down here, but I guess the Green Village School thing is a big disappointment for me. I don't know exactly how it came down, but I'm really annoyed that the project was allowed to eliminate the affordable housing component. I don't know if that was perhaps the Board of Ed had complete say and the borough couldn't sit on that discussion at all and had to basically take whatever the board did. But I doubt that's the case. I would imagine the borough is in some control here, and the borough could have said, we are going to have affordable housing component in the Green Village development. So we gave that away, and now we have to stuff it in where we can find a space for it. I'm sure that the numbers are going to come way down, and we're not going to be facing anywhere near like a 1,000-unit obligation, but it just seems a shame that this wasn't handled in a little more comprehensive, bigger picture kind of way. I am a firm advocate of low-income housing. I'm on the board of Habitat. Habitat International is in opposition, not to this project, but to any project where the result is that you consolidate the affordable housing in limited areas and you sort of pack them in. And we're beginning to do that here. And I think that's in part because we didn't take a bigger, wider view as a whole borough-wide to see what we could do to accommodate these needs in that larger sense. So I just think it's a shame that we gave it away at Green Village, and now we're sort of packing it in. And we gave 3 units away up at Strickland as well because we listened to the neighbors and backed off, and then we had developers come in and put duplexes up, which is what Habitat and Madison Housing Authority would have liked to have done. So we gave up 3 units as a result of that negotiation with the neighbors. So I just think we need to be a little more open about this with the community and engage the whole community on it as we go through it. This particular developer that's been selected, I guess, through some process is certainly well qualified, so I have nothing to say against the developer. I think RPM has got an excellent reputation, and I'm a big advocate for affordable housing, so it's more about process and the way we allocate it within the borough. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll, as I said, we'll answer some of those questions as we finish. Anyone else wishing to be heard? John?
I'm John Solu from Ridgedale Avenue. I don't want to repeat what Chris just mentioned, but I share in his concerns for the overall process that we're involved in. But I'm also concerned mainly about the thought process that would have to go in developing a community center. I mean, that's been our civic center. We've concentrated a lot of services that are provided there for the seniors, for our health and well-being. And I understand during the meetings that you held, part of what the developer's obligation would be to develop those same kind of facilities in this new structure. And along those lines, again, it's putting all these community services in an area where we are beginning to, as the phrase from the 50s and 60s was, redlining, meaning concentrating these kinds of housing developments in one area, putting them in areas where there'll be very minimal resistance from the surrounding area, as opposed to taking a broader view and looking at the entire community and using our current model of developing affordable housing. I think for the 166 units we currently pride ourselves in having, they're well dispersed throughout the community, as opposed to this effort, which seems to have, it sounds as though it's a quick and easy way out. It's a piece of property that we have that's deemed not necessary, considering the fact that we just recently appropriated some money in putting elevators and whatever. It kind of leaves us wide open for a lot of questioning from the community as to, what is going on here? How can it be viable just a few years ago, and all of a sudden now we deem it not viable? So we need to make sure that we vet all of this as we review it. Plus, a few years before that, we had an opportunity to relocate a building on Ridgedale Avenue by a builder to provide some affordable housing, and we deemed it unnecessary and refused to accept a structure that could have been moved down. It was a historic property that was on Ridgedale that could have been relocated. So again, and with what Chris mentioned about the KRE area, we seem to not have all our information together. It seems as though we're kind of at the 11th hour, kind of scrambling together to put something together. So I just want to make sure that in your deliberations, I don't want to take any more time, that those are clearly vetted and communicated to the community before we get too far along on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Hold off until we get, but keep that thought.
Sure.
Anyone else wishing to be heard or have questions? Yep.
I'm Sue Wickman, live on Walnut Street. My question is, not that I mind affordable housing, but what is it going to do to the property values? I live almost across the street from the Civic Center and also from Walnut Street, where there is a plan in place to possibly put in 11 units, condo units. That's going to affect me financially. Is the town going to somehow make sure that the rest of us on Walnut Street aren't going to be financially burdened with maybe a decrease in property value?
Okay. I'll capture that one as I look towards that. Would you be able to address that as far as? Hold off just a second, just in case there's any others, but I'll call you up to. Anyone else in the public wishing to be heard or ask a question? Yes, come on.
Hello, I'm Larry Wickman. I live across the street on Walnut Street as well. Part of my concern is the speed at which this is traveling and just trying to ramp up on everything at this point and digest it all. I know it's very early in the planning stages and all that. Being on the street, there's been that empty lot across from the Civic Center, and it's never been, much of anything really. The plan for 11 houses across the street came up last month, aside from the affordable housing. So there's a lot of worries on the street right now about two developments, not just one, not just the Civic Center and affordable housing. So from a neighbor standpoint, we've got more worries than just the Civic Center, because we're all kind of guessing at this point. We know there's another piece on the agenda tonight to address the property, the second property across the street. I think that's 34. So it's two concerns at this point. Also, as far as getting back to notice, we really didn't hear about this. We got one notice in the mail maybe a week before on the initial hearing in the Civic Center. I'm not too sure on my other neighbors, but also, are the folks who have kids in the school that's going up right next door getting notice of this as well? I mean, this, just as the other neighbors have pointed out, this is a full town issue, and especially with going affordable housing being next to schools, that's also a big question I'm sure the citizens will have a question on. And maybe that can also be addressed by how many affordable housing developments are done directly next to schools. We also have a full apartment complex from the view of our house as well, which is the General Wayne. So it's not like we have nothing similar in the area already. The concentration of all the housing on Walnut Street, Ridgedale Street intersection is just a very strange choice. Just the density, as everyone is saying, is a little scary just to think about where our neighborhood is going very quickly. That's really the only thing I have off the top of my head.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else wishing to be heard? Close the public portion of this, and I'll call Ed back up to it. So if you could address both property values and if any projects near schools and the impact. And another question I'm going to throw in there, that when we have the community meeting next week, would you be able to, at that point, share some renderings or what the plans for the site?
Sure. So certainly at the community meeting, we'll have developed a set of renderings and site plan with a fair amount of detail. So on the question of property valuation, I don't profess to be an expert on property valuation, but there's a very interesting study done just about a year ago out of Princeton University, and it was about the original Mount Laurel housing that was built in 2001. And so the Princeton group looked at a variety of factors. So Mount Laurel, as you know, is a suburban town outside of in Camden County. And the housing that was built there is about 200 units of affordable housing. And they looked at a variety of factors, including property valuations, and they concluded that there had been no impact on property valuations. And that book is called Climbing Mount Laurel. Douglas Massey, Massey, I think, is the lead author. As far as complexes that we have built that are near schools, we have done that in a number of occasions, and that's actually a tremendous asset for the residents to be able to walk their kids to school and the like. We haven't had any negative impacts as far as increased traffic or anything like that. It doesn't seem to be hasn't been a problem in any other locations. So the third question is just the rendering, so we'll have at the community meeting.
Thank you. I don't think we'll be able to answer all those questions, and Austria, as our liaison to planning, can cover some of the planning issues related to it. I think just to keep in mind, the timing of this, I certainly feel or understand the frustration, but as you heard Jim Bruno speak, the world of affordable housing is up in the air. It's been a struggle. For those of us that have young adult children, we know that the prospect of them staying in Madison is very small. It was pointed out at the community meeting that the 5 policemen that we just hired would be eligible for affordable housing, and right now it would only be a dream for them to live in the community. So overall, it's a theme. It's almost a moral obligation for the state to keep or allow for affordability throughout. These are the people that are working in our police departments, in our schools. They're working in our shops and towns, and so it is such a difficult thing to tackle, and it's regretfully the state has just kicked the can further down the line, and now it's so up in the air that communities like Madison have to move very quickly to come up with a plan so we don't have something show up at our door, as we received this letter earlier this week from a major builder saying, notify us of any plans you may have or what your steps are taking, because if you're not taking the right steps, we'll be at your door and we'll get it in there. There's a question around the Green Village Road School. as it went out, the option was to have inclusionary or to put money into the trust fund. And all the proposals that came in were opting to pay more for their property and putting in basically $2 million in the trust fund. While that can be frustrating, as we heard, what it will enable us to do is deliver more units for that $2 million than we would have been able to do otherwise. And so we'll be able to go further in our obligation and fill that need. And the questions about the building that we have invested in, and the back of the building is a usable building, especially now that we have a elevator. But if you remember from that meeting with the columns in the middle of the room, as far as the general meeting space, it is terrible. Even with the elevators, you have the seniors going up and down. And I won't even talk about the front of the building because that is the roof leaks, the windows let the wind through, and it's far from usable space. So it certainly is obsolete 100% in the back, and one could debate or 100% in the front, and one could debate the back as far as how we reinvested. Astra, you want to talk about planning?
Sure. Thank you, Mayor. The Planning Board has had a subcommittee that meets to discuss this as an issue of, where can we put our affordable housing. The courts have really constrained us by this ultimatum that, you've got to provide it and you've got to provide it now, or, you're going to have the builder's remedy. So we have passed an ordinance, the council, that says there must be inclusionary housing with any project that comes our way of 10 units or more. And we have looked at our different sites here in Madison, and there aren't many sites. And it's very difficult. So we're creating an overlay of the east end of town to try to reconfigure that to make it attractive to put an affordable housing component there. I mean, one of the nice things, Walnut Street is close to the center of town. Walnut Street has a school on it. Walnut Street has a couple of different zones there. And I understand clearly that, this seems awfully fast and furious, but today, towns like Madison are trying to develop their centers because people want public transportation. KRE is going to be a totally different project for the people of Madison, and we will have to embrace them and combine and bring them into our community and the Madison traditions, as well as anything else we develop. It is tough. We don't have much land, but we have this obligation, and I think we're trying to stay ahead of it with very quality work and a quality development. So I think that's about it.
Pat?
One other thing, we did discuss as a group the concern about the amount of traffic that's currently on Walnut and what this could potentially add to it. I think we're going to work with the Board of Ed to see if we can build a better circulation plan utilizing this property and possibly access over to Community Place, which would hopefully actually make things better than they are today.
There'll be a series of formal hearings. We've had no formal hearings. We're just having informal meetings right now. But once the process begins, everybody will be noticed, and it'll be a formal planning board process here at the council level. So there'll be many, many opportunities to weigh in on this project.
Ray, do you have any questions, anything else to add that I might not have answered that Sorry to put you on the spot.
That's okay. Not on the spot. Just in response to the way we've done housing, affordable housing, if you live on Chateau Thierry, there's 80 units of senior housing there. If you live on Central Avenue, we have 12 units of housing, Firehouse Apartments. If you live on Lawanica, we have 30 units of condominium developments. So this is not a deviation from our pattern. This is consistent with what we've tried to do to design attractive housing that when you ride by, you don't realize it's affordable housing and you can point to it. And I challenge anyone to go down Lawanica and distinguish the market rate condos from the affordable housing unit condos on the left-hand side as you go between Lawanica and Woodland. So in regard, I know John mentioned about the historic structure on Ridgedale. We tried to work cooperatively on that one to save it with the Housing Authority. That wasn't a borough issue. That was the Madison Housing Authority. working with the private developer who owned the unit, that we were trying to be the middleman to facilitate that. We would have loved to save that house and preserve it. Unfortunately, we weren't able to do it. So,
Yeah, thank you for capturing that. I meant to, yeah. Ostry?
Oh, one more thing, which we can announce tonight, is that the property next door to the Civic Center, we are actively seeking money from the county open space to acquire that as a pocket park for the whole neighborhood. And the builder or the developer of that property is aware that we are going to seek that grant for that property. So that would be entirely a pocket park for everybody in the neighborhood, which would really be a nice thing. Thank you.
And I mentioned the public meeting. I think the only thing curveball we have for Monday would be the joint meeting. So I think we can safely say, well, 6 o'clock, we'll do it here. If we're not able to move the location of the Madison Chatham joint meeting, at least 3 members will have to go to Chatham. But we're going to try to get the meeting moved here so the council members can stay here right till 7:30 and then go to the sewer treatment plant meeting. So put that on your calendar, 6 o'clock, Hartley Dodge. All right, any other discussion? So that's, we have the resolution 167 that is listed. And thank you for coming in. We'll see you same place. Yep, 6 o'clock.
Time difference was.
Right. Budget guidelines. Let me just, I've lost my notes here. Just going to say a few words and then hopefully not step on yours, Ben. But just a little reminder of the process we've been going through, a process that's not done in too many towns. A little over a year ago, we embarked on the planning to help guide the future of Madison. It was segmented in 4 areas: budget, capital, utilities, and operations/communications. Each committee has already presented back to the council, but it was just a presentation with not a whole lot of give and take. And so now we're at the level of more detailed conversation with the goal of formalizing the results. How each area gets formalized may be very different. For example, operations, I see their first step is creating or recreating our website as a better communications tool. So that will be their first step in formalizing their work. Tonight we'll hear the budget committee, which will, and the discussion on how we can formalize what can be best described as best practices for the borough. And anyone who has done long-range planning, or anyone who's planned a vacation or anything, knows that best laid plans are not set in concrete, and we can never predict the future. Just a little while ago, I saw a tornado warning coming across here. So you never know what the future will bring. So the best thing you can do is be prepared, put the tools in place, and you're ready for the ever-changing world. So with that, Ben.
Thank you. I only stepped a little bit.
Okay. Thank you.
I would like to begin by calling up 2 members of the committee. That's Art Powell and Mike Soriano, if you guys want to sit over here so you're a little closer. Tom Bittinger, who chaired the committee, unfortunately is unable to make it. And Paul Logier had been a member of the committee at the outset, but he moved to Harding and as a result stepped off. So we've got at least 60% of our committee in attendance tonight. The only additional item I wanted to mention with regard to the formation of these various strategic planning committees was that I had the intention of making them really resident-driven groups. We have a lot of talent in town. Much of it is stepped up on occasion when needed. I felt we certainly had enough local talent to take care of many of these subject areas. So I set 2 simple rules. Rule number 1 was no member of the council could chair any committee. And number 2 was only 1 member of the council could be represented on each committee. And I think it's had the effect I'd hoped, which is that we really are hearing from our residents. In this particular instance of the budget guidelines, it happened I was on the committee because at that time I was liaison to finance, and I got particularly interested in guidelines because when the first opportunity to work on the budget came along, I asked about them, and we didn't have any. So we looked at historical patterns and rules of thumb and various other things, but I felt that we could have had a much more informed debate. We could have had some interesting benchmarks to aim for when we were trying to figure out various portions of our budget. And it probably would have opened us up, I think, to a discussion that would have been more accessible to our residents. So we got looking at the world of guidelines, and we met regularly and quite frequently, actually, over the course of the summer of 2014, so that by the end of 2014, our job was pretty much done. We had formulated a report which was presented to the council in this room on December 9th, and that report was also put up on Rosenet and made available as hard copy. Prior to that event, we briefed, at their request, members of the council. So we had either small groups or individuals. Most council members took advantage of our invitation to do so, and I think both sides of those conversations found it interesting and quite productive. We subsequently made some modifications to the guidelines as a result of those sessions. We, at that point, then elected to step back and not look to memorialize the guidelines at that moment, simply because we were in the midst of the budget process. We also didn't feel that our guidelines were sufficiently formalized to drive the budget discussion in 2015. Although, in talking to my fellow members and to some residents, I think people generally felt that these guidelines informed the process this year, even though they hadn't been formally adopted. After we went through the budget, some members of the council asked for further consideration of the guidelines and further discussion, which we gladly welcomed, and indeed, again, incorporated some changes. The fluidity of the guidelines does not bother us, as you'll hear in a few moments. We did not set these guidelines up thinking they would be emblazoned on a plaque or carved into granite. They are intended to be flexible as events change so that they are useful over time. We don't anticipate that the Madison of 2015 will look anything like the Madison of 2025 when it comes to financial considerations, but we still feel guidelines ought to be in use in 2025, and that will only be the case if these guidelines are adjusted to reflect changes. Now, I have an interesting, useful bit of trivia for you. We have not invented guidelines in our committee. I did this small experiment just to see how prevalent guidelines are in the world of local finance. If you Google, as I did, some combination of the word applications to budget, guidelines, financial planning, and municipality, you will get somewhere between, and I verified this twice, 69 and 80 million hits. Now, admittedly, as we all know, a lot of times the hits are really erroneous, right? So say 1% of them was right on target. That would be approximately 800,000 instances of people talking about the application of guidelines to municipal budgets. So far from having invented this, we sort of are at the back of the charge, but nevertheless, we're still there. I found one of the interesting comments on doing this web search came from the Government Finance Officers Association. It's an organization of 18,000 plus finance officers of municipalities and states. And they've been in operation since 1906. It's considered the most prestigious organization of its type. So I began reading one of their papers on guidelines, and I found this quote, this paragraph that I'd like to read to you as a quote, which, after the fact, captures what we were really trying to accomplish. The quote is, "The release of the council guidelines will not solve all the problems encountered in budgeting, a complex process that involves politics, compromise, and competing visions of the role of government in serving the citizenry. What the guidelines can do is enhance the quality of decision-making by encouraging practices that illuminate the key issues and choices facing the community. What I'd now like to do is turn it over to Mike Soriano, who will discuss in further detail the approach of our committee. Mike.
Before I start, and I do want to just read a short, brief comment, I feel to some extent we're preaching to the choir because from my perspective, we had very positive feedback in one-on-one, two-on-one, whatever meetings that we had with council members, and with all the comments that we had during the budget process referring to the guidelines. So in that respect, I think to a great degree we've made a lot of progress already on this subject. But I'd like to read something and as an overview really say that how we look at the guidelines as a positive step towards an enhanced decision-making process. The mayor and council make decisions that involve trade-offs that balance the costs of the public's desire for services and infrastructure against the revenue to be raised to pay for these services and infrastructure. The decision-making process results in an annual budget which expresses in financial terms those trade-offs. The process of evaluating the trade-offs is aided by key measures which have been agreed to in advance. The Strategic Budget Committee, with the help of the Borough Administration and others, has expressed these key measures in the form of guidelines that cover municipal surplus, operating revenues and appropriations, utilities, debt service and incurrence, capital funding, and property taxes and their subsequent reporting. The individual guidelines include a range of outcomes which are deemed acceptable based on history and current information that together assist in achieving the goal, a budget that is financially prudent, consistent, stable, and predictable. A deviation from the guidelines is an indication that it is deserving of further analysis by the administration, mayor, and council to weigh the pros and cons before making a decision which falls outside the guidelines. The guidelines should not be considered as hard and fast rules that cannot tolerate exceptions. Rather, they should be seen as firm but flexible and to be complied with over the long term, with any material deviations publicly disclosed and explained as part of the budget process. The guidelines provide additional structure to the annual budget process to assure that a decision on one part of the budget does not have unintended consequences on another element of the budget. This can be especially important as deadlines for the budget are approached. Finally, the guidelines can help form the basis of communicating to the public some of the trade-offs involved in achieving the balanced budget required by statute. The Strategic Budget Committee supports a resolution passed by the Council as a key step in institutionalizing the use of guidelines in the annual budget process. Thank you. Now, Art is going to take you through the specific guidelines, and I believe there's going to be some give and take along the way.
And for the record, for the people looking at the bottom line, it's no longer confidential, so you can share this with your neighbors.
Most of what you're going to hear this evening is in the final report that we issued last week. You've heard Ben and Mike talk about their views on the guidelines. I thought we should reinforce it with a visual. The balance on the far right of the slide has kind of become our committee's logo. You'll see at the top of the logo the 4 principles that we've spoken to. You'll see at the bottom, forming a foundation, are the guidelines that we're proposing. Council is in the middle, and it balances spending and revenues, taking into consideration the principles and the guidelines. And if all of us do our job right, we come out with some very good, very sound outcomes that are good financially for the town and provide the services that people want. Before I get into the individual guidelines, there are 3 umbrella comments that I would like to make. The first, you've heard most of this already. The guidelines help with the annual process, with the long-term process, the balance, and it flags deviations that are worth further review. Second is how we develop the guidelines. And we looked at a bunch of things, maybe not the 800,000 hits that Ben spoke to, but we looked at a lot of material, and you've seen the material that we've looked at. We took into consideration the financial principles we spoke about, but also what are best practices that we found in our research. Number 2, we looked at a lot of history, a lot of numbers, and we developed trends for the borough. You're all aware of, we have public debt, so the rating agencies we have to pay heed to. And we looked at what the rating agencies want for the most highly rated municipalities. Madison is one of those. And lastly, and this was towards the end of our work, we took into consideration the reports from the utility and capital committees. Every guideline is a unique mix of these reasons, and we're going to talk about each one in a minute or two. The third item is it's to be re-examined. When stuff happens, and we know stuff is going to happen, whether there is new information that comes to light or whether there is a major event in town or in the state, we want to re-examine. But I think the important point to drive home tonight is let's start with something and then get some experience, and then if we need to change it, let's do that. So I'm going to walk through each guideline, and after each set of guidelines, I'll invite questions. So the first one we're going to talk about is surplus. Surplus is something that we really wrestled with to try to get an understanding of.
Art, can I interrupt you for 1 second? I just want to ask
Absolutely.
Ben, are we looking at the next meeting or sometime in the very near future to turn this into the resolution that Mike talked about? Okay, so tonight is really the kind of the final fine-tuning of this? Okay, thank you.
So the first thing is surplus, and there are 3 guidelines for surplus. The first one is the surplus that you put into the annual budget should be no more than what you earned in the prior year. 3 reasons for that. First, surplus is a very important thing, so it's got to be well managed. Number 2, by having this guideline that keys to what you generate, it tends to stabilize things over time, and it avoids the wide swings that we've had historically in the amount of surplus that has gone into the budget. And lastly, this is something the rating agencies care a lot about. The second surplus guideline says at the end of any calendar year, we should have surplus of 20 to 25% of our coming year's appropriations. So in other words, if our budget is about $30 million, and that's about what it is, 25% of that would be $7.5 million. The 20 to 25% range we feel is a good balance between the surplus that we need to put into the budget as revenue and what we have to retain as an emergency for things that might happen. It's also a best practice range that we discovered. And as I've said before, the rating agencies care deeply about this. The third surplus target, or guideline I should say, is that to the extent we end a calendar year with more than 25% of the coming year's appropriations as surplus, that excess over 25 can be, but doesn't have to be, used for our longer-term obligations, the Capital Improvement Fund, or CIF, or to pay down debt. The reasons for this is we feel that excess surplus should be used for the long term, not short-term needs. And this gives us some revenue flexibility. If we had $500,000 of extra surplus that we could put into the budget, it would mean we wouldn't have to raise taxes. It would mean that we wouldn't have to transfer that $500,000. It's not saying that that's what has to happen. It just creates some flexibility. So let me stop, see if there are any questions or comments about the three surplus.
So just so the public knows, in between, it'll just be council discussion. The public will be able to comment and ask questions at the very end. So we'll, yeah, Bob, why don't you sit here, so you're at the microphone.
So I'm just taking questions at this point, or we're just taking questions at this point from council.
Yes, and so just to reinforce the surplus, one of the, again, the advantages of limiting them or using the excess for what could be called one-time expenses is you don't have to make it up the next year. That say there is a $500,000 excess, use it in capital, you don't have to figure out how to come up with that extra $500 in the next year.
That's right. It's not tied to earning it.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, Bob?
Well, thank you. First of all, being a former internal auditor at J.P. Morgan and in charge of their internal compliance, I appreciate all the work you've done. Trust me, it was needed. In terms of the percentages that you have, and that's what I want to focus on right now, you said it was based on historical numbers?
There's no one thing that determined where we came out.
Mm-hmm.
I think the surplus numbers were based more on what the rating agencies cared about and what were best practices. We certainly looked at historical trends in trying to understand where Madison was, but it wasn't history that guided us in the surplus realm.
And in terms of the rating agencies, they said that 25% number or that is a good number?
We didn't talk directly to rating agencies. This was through the administration that interacts with the rating agencies. And it's my understanding, and Ben, correct me if I'm wrong, that range, the 20-25%, if we want to talk about that one, was consistent with the most highly rated municipalities.
Yeah, I'll just add to that. I was at the meeting with representatives of S&P that resulted in our getting reaffirmed as AAA credit. And in the course of that meeting, we discussed the size of surplus. Numbers like 20-25% got kicked around. S&P will not give you a definitive number. However, they certainly were not uncomfortable when we started with, is it bigger than a bread box? So we kind of worked our way to this 20-25%. And as Art said, in looking through the financial literature, a lot of it empirically based on what other states and municipalities do, this range came up often as the kind of golden range, the prudent place to be. The other thing I might mention is the business about not eating through your surplus. In other words, you don't spend more than you generate. This borough got into difficulty with S&P over that very issue, and it happened for a few years running. And I'd like to think that had we been looking at the guidelines at that time, it would have been evident. But instead, it's very easy. That was last year's budget. Now we're on to this year's budget. Who remembers what we did a year ago? I mean, I'm not saying that as a criticism. I'm just saying that as one of the reasons that we feel these guidelines are necessary.
Right.
They help you to track.
I remember when the borough did get in trouble for chewing through its surplus. More water went into the tub than came out.
I bring that up only because that indeed is in response to S&P.
And then what would happen, let's say we have a bad year, for whatever reason. Maybe if we have a bad year and we can't build up surplus, what would be the implications for the next year?
Well, a couple of different things. Surplus might be constrained that could go into the budget to the extent that council wanted to abide by the guidelines.
Right.
If they want to deviate from the guidelines, there should be some discussion and analysis as to why that was the case by looking at, well, why is it that we didn't generate the surplus? What is behind that? Because that would be a significant difference from our history.
Right.
We have consistently been able to generate the surplus. So in a year when we don't, that's why we should start looking at things. And so this guideline would cause that investigation discussion and then provide some information as to what to do.
So effectively, what this is saying is we should always target 20 to 25%, and then anything over 25%, we should go toward, as you put it, debt service and possible capital projects. It wouldn't go toward, let's say, replacing. Would that include capital equipment, such as, let's say, damaged police cars and things along those lines?
Now, whatever the definition of capital improvement fund is, the definitions can be worked out.
Okay.
Our point is it should be for longer-term purposes, not to fund operating needs.
Okay. All right.
Are there other questions? Or we'll go. Pat's hand was. I think he hit the buzzer first.
So 2 questions about surplus. One is we are currently in an excess surplus situation. We are over the 25%.
For 2014, that was correct.
No, for 2015.
Well, I think we're saying the same thing. We measure it at the end of the calendar year.
Okay. Yeah, I guess that's true. But I mean, it would have been in this year's budget. I don't think we really did anything about that. But I am also wondering, how easy is it to actually say that you're going to dedicate the excess, if you will, to just capital, because our budget is kind of fungible anyway.
Because money is fungible.
Yeah. So that's a good aspiration. I'm wondering how we're going to be able to do that. That's why that's kind of more of a guideline than a hard and fast rule.
I'm sure the accounting.
But I think one of the themes you will hear.
The baseline would be anyway. Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think one of the themes you will hear throughout this is all it does is create conversation with the sitting council at the time.
Mm-hmm.
How they address it will be up to that council, but at least they will have the discussion.
Okay.
And someone may say is you just played a shell game, or they would say you addressed, you met the intent.
Yeah, and you were focusing on the municipal budget, but I wonder if we step back and looked at all of our surplus accounts, maybe not, or maybe as we go forward as kind of we actually have quite a bit of money in surplus when you go across all the accounts. We should possibly take that into account. We're in a unique position. S&P is used to going into towns where they have just one general surplus. We've got 3, and the electric surplus is right now fairly sizable. The other thing is I do agree with the range, at least at this point. I'd have to look at it going forward. But, to me, 20 is the minimum. Numbers above that sort of become your rainy day fund, so that there are going to be times if you do have a problem financially, let's say for some reason our tax collectibles fell significantly, we do have the ability to tap into that on a short-term basis. I think the problem we had in the past was nobody really took a multi-year view, like, we're doing it this year, but why? And is it going to be something we can reverse next year easily, or is this going to be something that's because the surplus tends to either be an upward or a downward spiral. Right now we happen to be in an upward spiral, and we have the kind of situation where we've got to try to figure out how to stop it from growing to keep it at 25%, if that's what our goal is.
But either way, the 20 to 25, if it's on the low end, it prompts one kind of discussion. Above 25, it prompts another. The value added is the discussion.
And I agree, and it's not even just the once you're outside the range, I think is when you start to have to, as you said, exceed the growth in the surplus last year. In other words, if you're going to make the surplus lower in the following year, you do need to take a hard look at, is that a one-year experience, or is this going to be a multi-year issue? And then how are we going to stop it before we get below 20%?
Yeah, I know this is, unfair, but when we get to 7, you'll see that.
Okay.
Okay. And I do agree. I do want to have more of a conversation about the history and trends. I think it does apply more in other areas. The past is not always a good indicator of the future. In this area, I think it is. This particular set of guidelines is a good set. I appreciate it.
Okay.
Carmela, you were trying to buzz in?
Yeah.
Okay.
I agree with Pat about all of our surpluses. We really have to look at every single one of them, including the water surplus, which people have a tendency to ignore because electric surplus is like so great. But I'm looking at this, and you said here is that 25%, if it goes over 25% of the total appropriations, may be used for the capital improvement fund or to pay down debt. Are we allowed to do that with surplus?
And
We
it
can
depends.
transfer.
And it depends on the
Can
debt,
transfer?
the type of debt as far as
Okay.
paying down.
Some of the short-term debt, definitely.
Yeah,
Yeah, you could definitely pay down the short term, of which we
the
have.
short term.
We have a meaningful amount.
We pay for that every year, so we're happy to decide.
I think the other part of that is one of our decisions, and I'm not quite sure if this was part of your plan, was to completely reduce the capital improvement fund. Am I
To
correct,
reduce
or am
it?
I
No,
getting?
absolutely not.
Was,
But,
okay.
but I also want to correct one thing, Carmel, if you don't mind. This is not a plan. These are flexible guidelines. And I
Right.
think that
Oh, I get that.
distinction
Yeah,
is
I
not.
understand that.
That distinction is quite significant, at least
I'm
it is
just
to us.
trying to understand,
No, I appreciate that.
We're sitting here next year, and we're wondering about, some of these questions. Okay, I think that was it. Thank you.
Okay, other comments or questions? So for the committee's sake, I'm hearing that this guideline makes sense, and as we work on formalizing, you're on the right track. Is that, that's
Thank
what
you.
I've kind of heard.
We think they all make sense, but that's
Yep,
okay.
but that's, they all make sense, and let me use the better, people are comfortable with it also.
All right. Well, the second guideline, and there are 7 altogether, deals with a concept that our committee constructed called operating shortfall. And the guideline is that for the current level of municipal services, the operating shortfall should not exceed 7% of the total appropriations or the total budget. The first set of bullet points is the definitional, what operating shortfall is. And the second is really the importance here. And the 7% is really based on current and foreseeable future. It's as far as we could look into the crystal ball. But I think the important thing here is the operating shortfall, which is a historical practice in Madison, brings to the fore the trade-offs between the cost of the services we provide and how we're funding it. And then within the funding, do we use it from municipal sources or do we take it from the electric utility? So this guideline is intended to really say when we total it all up and we have this operating shortfall, what do? We can cut costs, we can raise other money, or we can take it from the utilities. That's the extent of my comments. 2 is very simple. Well, 2 is short. It may not be simple.
Pat?
So I don't remember the formula, so I'm going to ask you a question, and you might have to answer it first by explaining the formula. Last year, we actually got to 7.8%.
Last year being 14.
2014, yeah, this was actual budget. Would one of the ways to have closed that would have to have been raising more through property taxes? Because I think
Yes.
that's the relationship. Okay.
That's one way. That's one of many ways.
So that's where you're saying if you're raising the services, you cap the amount of money you're taking from other places at 7%, and then the rest would have to be funded through.
We're saying don't run an operating shortfall or deficit greater than 7%. And we think that the current combination of services and finances will tolerate a 7% operating shortfall.
But again, what does not make up the shortfall? In terms of where do the revenues that are not part of the shortfall come from? In other words, the gap between
only utility transfers.
Okay. Fine. And one other thing. So this is one of those areas, though, where you did change it from the initial report that we were given in January. Originally, it was a 9%.
It was 7 to 9%.
7-9. But let's say 9's always the top. What made you lower it down to a harder
Well,
7?
A couple of things. The history had included, in 14 anyway, the reserve for property tax appeals.
Okay.
So that was kind of a distortion.
Yes.
The 15 budget brought it way down, and then our projections based on the 15 budget suggested that we meaning Madison, could live within the 7% or lower.
So that does raise one interesting thing that was always one of my concerns, which is I didn't really want to see guidelines that we necessarily just, what I would say, backed into. In other words, they worked with the current budgeting. So I just wanted to be sure that you guys still feel comfortable that it's not just a matter of, well, we looked out and 7% looks good. You still feel, though, regardless of what the next couple of years looks like, that 7% is still a fair number to shoot for.
I guess another way to look at it is we could do 10 years at 7%, but 10 years in a row at 8% would raise concerns.
I'm sorry.
These are guidelines that you can fluctuate year to year, but you're looking at history that if you went year after year.
We're looking at history, and we're looking at the progress the town has made in bringing the operating shortfall lower.
Yep.
And so if the glide path is to keep reducing it, which I think would be good, then 7% will be doable. If the glide path reverses and we start seeing the shortfalls of history, we've got some stuff to talk about.
Yep. Rob?
So if I understand it correctly, assuming a $30 million budget, the most we could transfer from the electric utility to cover operating is $2.1 million.
I'll assume you did the math correctly, yes.
And the amount we could transfer from the electric utility for capital improvements is essentially unlimited.
Well, we haven't got to that yet.
No, there's a cap on that, too.
Pardon me?
There's a cap on total appropriations.
We'll get to the capital part of that in the later guidelines.
Bob?
Okay, so you're going to hear this kind of a question from me throughout this presentation, which is the 7%. This is a number which, through looking at our past performance as well as history and your judgment, that's what we should aim at.
Yes.
Be it it's flexible.
Yes.
But like Rob just used that number to calculate the max that we could take from the electric utility, correct?
7% of 30 million, 2.1 million. Yeah.
It's a factor. It's not the only factor.
Okay.
I think it's important also to indicate that history is something we looked at, but we didn't always endorse it.
No, I understand.
I mean, history gave us guidance in some areas that we thought was worth taking, and in other areas we thought if there had been guidelines, we wouldn't have had that happen. So it's a mixture, and there's
I
a
get
lot
that.
of there's
I
a
get
lot
that
of
entirely.
experience
It's just that,
Well,
you know,
and I think there are other nuances behind the discussions that led to these ranges. So, for example, we're very conservative. We, again, Madison, very conservative on how we budget appropriations.
Absolutely.
So, as a result, that raises the operating shortfall, just by definition. And so, if we were tighter on that, we could have a lower range. But we wanted to recognize not just the history of the numbers, but the history of the practices of the administration.
Right. And I'm glad that you said at the beginning that these are guidelines and they're flexible, because what I don't want to see happen is that these numbers become locked in people's heads, and then that governs how we budget next year and the years after. And that was a very good point that you made.
Jim, you have some information?
I just want to mention, so kind of almost as an example, so imagine we're at the budget hearing and we come out and it's 7.8%, which is what Pat is saying it was this year. You would say, well, Jim, what could we do to get it to 7%? And Pat was kind of alluding to that. It's pretty simple. We reduce expenses. We find ways to reduce expenses. In this instance, 0.8% is a couple $100,000 we'd have to reduce expenses by. We have to increase fees, license fees, parking fees, permit fees, whatever it is to make up the shortfall. Increase the amount of property tax we're thinking of, or we could increase the surplus usage, but there's other guidelines that might restrict that. So those are kind of the four areas where, you know, if you said, hey, or the fifth one is, let's stick with 7.8% because we think the utility can fund that additional.
And that's part of it, yep.
All the historical analysis you're talking about that you've done, did you geometrically weight it, or did you just kind of take some sort of...
It was in most cases, it was just a straight mean, the arithmetic average. In some cases, we threw out the high and the low because there were just obvious outliers, but we didn't do any more sophisticated averaging.
Any other questions or comments? So just on these comments here, I think there's a little less comfort level, but people understand. And so
I don't actually have a problem with 7%. And again, these are to some degree goals that we're going to set for ourselves as we do the budget. And I think the key thing is, if we're not going to hit it, that we explain this year what our options are to make it, or to accept it as is, but what are we going to try to do in the subsequent
But
years?
I think the reality is in 15, we're below the 7.
Yes, you are.
Like at 5.5 or something like that. I don't have the report in front of me, but
5.1.
and I think for 16 and 17, comparable numbers.
And-
so there's
and-
already a cushion
Correct.
in the 7%.
And as Jim just pointed out, as if we had these guidelines, as management puts the budget together, they would explain, these are the implications if we got it down to 7%, but we're proposing 7.8, and the choices would be made. All right, very good.
Okay. The third set of guidelines, there are two for utility transfers. The first one is that the utility budgets should recognize that the municipal budgets will likely require transfers of 22% of our total appropriations. Now, this is clearly and exclusively based on the historical average. And one way to look at the 22, and I think you were getting at this, Robert, is that 7% of that is the operating shortfall from the previous guideline we talked about. And then the subtraction of 7 from 22 would leave 15% of the transfers going to the capital items of the Capital Improvement Fund and debt service. The second one kind of looks at it from more detail of the utilities and says 22% is the guideline, but we also have to consider what do the utilities need by way of their own needs. And we've listed three things: the working capital, capital expenditures, long-term capital, and a contingency reserve because stuff happens. This guideline doesn't have any numbers because primarily we're waiting for the consultants' reports that are looking at the utilities. But what we think this does, even without any numbers in it, is it begins to continue the discussion about how much goes to the municipal budget and how much has to stay in the utilities. And by having these guidelines here for utility transfers, that discussion occurs as part of the budget process. That's all I have to say on the utilities.
Rob?
So I guess the question I have for this is, have we consulted with the other strategic planning committees? Because if I take this, and again, I may be misunderstanding, if we're going to limit the amount of surplus the borough can have, but we're not going to limit the amount of surplus the utility can have, but we're going to limit transfers, theoretically, we can have an infinite, obviously not ever, but we can have a massive utility surplus when in fact we don't need one. So wouldn't we force better discipline and potential savings to the ratepayers if we were also to limit the amount of surplus, and it might be a very high number, that the utility can have?
There are a couple different things in your question. First, none of these are limits. These are not intended to prevent any action the council wants to take. These are simply signposts in the analysis of the budget to say, oh, we're getting close, we better start taking do some looking at it. But we can still go above it or below it, depending on what kind of guideline it is. I think early on in our committee deliberations, we thought about having this as an Uber analysis, meaning take into consideration the two utilities. And we concluded that that would just take a lawful long time. We had two other committees involved with the capital and the utilities. And I think the risk of the surplus building up in the utilities is something that has to be dealt with. But this doesn't say the utility can just hold on to it. Again, there's nothing that prevents the council from saying, we need that surplus.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah.
Okay.
I just wanted to
have these guidelines, we're going to want to abide by them.
But,
but
what I'm taking from this is it has future councils make sure that the utilities that we maintain the utility, that we're just not pulling without regard to maintaining the infrastructure of water or electric.
Right, I think
that is number one before you start overdrawing.
Well, I don't know. I don't know if I want to get into a 1 and 2, but it's a balance in between what does the municipal budget need versus what the utilities need. I think some of the new numbers in the final report talked about, if you looked at the surplus that remains in the utility, particularly the electric utility, after the transfers, it's come way, way down compared to history where we used to keep a lot more there. And I think those are the type of insights that the Administration Council just has to start developing and paying more attention to. And so when we know what the numbers are, we can make some sense out of them.
Ben?
Yes, I want to get back to a question that Councilman Catanello raised. We, and Martin Barbados here, who chaired the utility committees, Martin and Tom Bittinger and I met several times during the course of this work to ensure that we were in sync. And although this is not verbatim what is in the utility report, it is consistent with that. And at one stage, we had a meeting where our committee met with Martin, so to make sure that we were all in sync. And we very much agree that this notion of what you need money for in the utility has not been really explicitly talked about. So we like the fact that it's now been enumerated in a way that makes some sense.
I totally agree, and I'm sure, I don't know if you recall, but in previous budget discussions, we've always personally advocated for leaving more money in the capital.
I recall that.
However, when I just run things out to its absurd extreme,
right?
You can, which is what I think you have to do.
Yes.
As a risk manager, is I would hate to see to the point where we're doing. I'd love to see we're doing so well. The utility surplus stays big. We're transferring 5%, 4%, 3%. The budget, and then you would have this. Assuming we don't cut rates, we would have this massive surplus sitting in the utility, and we need to think about the taxpayer as well.
Yes, I agree. And there are two things I would like to add to that. One is that there was a time, excuse me, in the borough, and not that long ago, that the utilities were allowed to build up inordinately large surplus. Yeah, surplus of a magnitude that really we could have waived property taxes in certain years. And that was sort of under the covers, and we believed that following this kind of guideline, it would have been obvious. And we would have said, what in the world are we doing? And the other part is, as the performance of the electric utility changes and/or decisions regarding reliance on its surplus for other purposes changes, the guideline can be changed.
Well, if the surplus were to build up in the utility, that's exactly the kind of substantial development that I spoke about earlier that would cause us to re-examine the guidelines.
Thank you.
Pat?
So this is another one of the items you changed. Originally, this was 20. It's at 22. And it's the one area we're probably the most out of variance, because I think this year we're at 23, and the pro forma budget we got for next year and the year after shows it actually going up to 24.6 and then possibly coming down to 24%. So this is the one area where, we're out of compliance. We don't seem to really have any way of getting back into compliance.
It's not an issue of compliance.
Well, whatever you want to call it. What's the right term?
Well, it's a deviation.
It's a deviation, okay.
And so, as we said, we think when there's a deviation, it's worth discussing.
I understand that. So I guess my question is, if we're setting a guideline and we don't seem to have any plans to meet it, we didn't really have a discussion this year, and I almost wonder why we're even setting it at 22%. I mean, this is the one area where I did agree with the 20%, because I've kind of maintained from the beginning of my term, and even before that we over-rely on the electric utility to fund the borough. And, going from 20 to 22 doesn't make me happy, and having it at 24 and not really seeming to have any plan to bring it back down, makes me even less happy. So this is one of the guidelines that I'm not particularly thrilled seeing go up.
Well, let me just say, any plan to take it from 24 to 22 is not the responsibility of this committee.
I understand that.
That's the responsibility of this council.
That's true, but so is accepting these guidelines.
No,
yeah.
I understand.
Okay.
But I want to emphasize that, this is like saying, please don't cross the street, in certain places. I mean, if you choose to do it, good luck. But, The point is, it underscores something that should be looked at. Now, you could advocate for saying it's too high, and I would like to see it lower. And indeed, as it builds up over time, there may be a good argument for saying take it down to 20%.
Is what builds up over time. No, but this is the amount of utility transfer that
I'm sorry, I meant the transfer.
Okay. Well, where would the money come from then? Not coming from there. It's got to come from somewhere else. Okay.
That's the discussion.
You know, that's
Which
not-
is I know it's another item. No, but I guess
Discussion you
my
had
concern.
the budget.
My concern in this area is that we're setting goals for ourselves. We're using the strategic planning committee, but we're agreeing to these goals because this is what we want to shoot for in next year's budget. So, from my perspective, what I'd like to make them
I wouldn't necessarily
is
see them as goals.
why not? Well, what else is what is a guideline?
It's a conversation generator. I would call it the Ricky Ricardo thing. You've got some splaining to do.
But to me, then it's a goal you're shooting for, and then if you can't reach it, you explain to people why. I mean, that's.
But it is just to make sure that it forces this council and future councils just to explain why there's a variation. It doesn't say you can't do it, and if there is 5 years in a row with 24%, I would see the council saying, this guideline needs to be adjusted because we're explaining it every year, and it seems 24% is what makes sense.
I look at it as a tool in my toolbox that I can use to help me examine our budget and question, what we're doing that year. It's just one of many things that I will use, and I found this helpful, especially their alternate budget process is so much easier to read than our budget process.
I mean, the way I view it is, when we agree to this, this will go back to who's ever running the budget next year, and this will be what they'll start to try to make sure the budget comes within. There will be a lot of other things that they have to be concerned about, but they're also, one of their overriding concerns is going to be that they try to meet these guidelines. If they're not able to, they'll come back and try to explain to us what choices we have if we do want, as a council, to meet them, or if not, why we can't do it.
Because there's some historical basis for how these guidelines were formed, is why I would use them as a starting off point.
And that's where I did say at the beginning, histories and trends, you can go back as far as you want. To me, the critical thing in my mind is what happened to us, 7, 8 years ago, where we were becoming more heavily reliant on the electric utility, and I think we suffered as a result. And that's why I really prefer not to see us in that position. And that's, to me, I throw out all the rest of the 20 years of history before that, because that type of scenario is not likely to exist in our future. Mike wants to say something.
Mike, you need to come up to the microphone, please.
By their very nature, there's more volatility.
Yes.
And I don't know the answer to the capital question. So if we had a, quote, answer to the capital question in terms of where it is in the range of straight line versus useful life, we might be able to pin this down a little bit more. The other part of utilities we've talked about is the fact that who knows what the price of purchase power is going to be. And then you have another factor that you can bring into the mix, which you've talked about, are the rates and the trade-off of surplus from the electric utility versus property taxes. So this lets you have a process to discuss all these things, but it doesn't lock you into a specific thing.
And that was something actually you guys did mention here somewhere. It's in the earlier part, but I think it would be good for us to have a discussion at some point is, which is better for us in terms of electric rates versus property tax rates.
It's absolutely a discussion this council should have.
Go ahead.
I also want, just if I may, very quickly, if we had been doing this year over year and looked at this, right, your point may well have come through, right? And several years ago, when we got on that path, that point would have been obvious. Yeah. So, again, that's one of the things we wanted to accomplish. Whether it should be 22 or 20, that's up to the council.
I love the process. I love the idea. I think in some respects there are a couple of things in terms of what I would consider our goals. You can call them other things. And I'm going to keep calling them goals that we should be a little tighter on. That's my point.
So if I can, it sounds like we're a little mixed on this one as far as the comfort. We understand the concept, comfort level on the exact numbers. We're mixed as it compares to recent history. Okay. Next one.
Okay. The next one is short and sweet. We have two on debt service. Debt service is interest and principal on the debt that we have. We don't think that it should exceed 10% of total appropriations. It's currently about 8%. And any new borrowing should be only for the longest term assets of 15 years or longer. There are two reasons for this. Both are prudent limits on mortgaging the future. You hear a lot about that in government, from Washington to the state level. We don't want to have to deal with it here. And the rating agencies, I think, are very outspoken on being conservative, particularly if you want to reach and retain a AAA rating.
Any questions or comments on it? Oh, Pat?
My only comment is I agree with the 10% limit. I think, and it's not something we're going to face in the next couple of years because we do have a degree of certainty in the pricing of our electricity. But if we ever got to the point where the cost started to go up significantly, we would have to start to re-question whether we're going to significantly, well, we're going to have to increase rates just to maintain some of the level that we have. But, you know, to what extent are we going to have to then look to possibly, yeah, debt service. Right now, we're not incurring debt service because we're mainly funding our capital out of the electric utility. But if
No, we're talking about outstanding debt.
yeah, well,
So in other
incurring
words-
new debt.
So, yes, so in
Well,
other
there's
words, the
two.
question would be, you know, should we go out and meet our capital needs by funding it with long-term debt?
The answer is no.
The answer is yes until you get to around 10% where it starts to get a little nasty.
Okay.
That's
Is that something we actually got guidance from S&P, or we've reviewed other towns who have AAA bond ratings? I mean, how do we come up with the 10% number?
Again, I think it's, I wasn't privy to those conversations, but it's from Ben and from Robert
Okay.
Califoot that these are the thresholds that will help protect the AAA.
As I said, right now I don't see this for the next several years. I just think that this is one of those goals that's going to have to be seriously re-examined if the price of electricity starts going up
Well, and
significantly.
that, again, I go back to what I said at the outset. If there's a significant development and a spike in electricity prices would be a significant development, we've got to come back to the table.
Can't go much lower.
What's that?
They can't go much lower.
Yeah.
So, you know,
So it sounds like a high comfort level with this.
All right. Okay. Capital funding. The capital improvement fund in each budget should be 10 to 13%. It's a little bit higher than in the draft report. Spending out of the capital improvement fund kind of occurs in lumps as we think about it, based on what we want to spend money on. But we feel that we should regularly set aside money for the capital improvements that we know an aging town like Madison is going to have. And our estimates for the 10 to 13 were based in part upon what we haven't been spending in the past for the capital improvement fund, and in part by the recommendations from the capital committee.
One other thing to add, the reason there was a revision to this is because there was a revision in what seemed to be the thinking in the council as to how much money should be allocated to the capital improvement fund. As we said earlier, there are consultants now working on this and at portions of it, and the committee that was focused on capital is going to be reconstituted to look into the question of how much do we need every year to keep our capital properly maintained and up to snuff. And those exercises could well change this by informing us of a different number.
Yeah,
Bob?
I mean, oh, sorry.
We're going to go with Bob first this time. Pat,
Yeah, I think this is going to be a real soft number because you said it yourself. Madison's a very old town, and you don't know what you don't know yet. So the 10 to 13% I could see being much higher than that, because what you're really saying is, say, if you go with the 10% of a $30 million budget, $3 million, we've already exceeded that this year, and it could go much higher once the electric utility finishes its work.
Well, we've exceeded the 10% lower threshold. We're
Right.
still within the range.
Yeah.
But we still could go higher than that. That's my point.
Budget, you'd be clearing, you wouldn't be clearing, you're getting very close to $4 million.
Right.
capital improvement.
And it could go higher. That's my only comment about this one. This is a real soft number as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, okay.
Yes, Pat?
I was going to say, looking ahead, we seem to be within, we even could have stayed within the 8 to 12. I agree 8 was too low. I think 10 is a good minimum number. You know, we may have to go over. Was there any reason that you guys found why there was a limit on how high you'd want to go? I mean, you don't want to spend all your money on capital, but, you know, is there a reason why we just don't say greater than 10% and leave it at that?
I mean, I think this range ended up being as a result of handling among all the interested parties.
Can you translate that to English?
Negotiating.
Okay. Thank you.
No, you know, what I would add to it is, I mean, it's a range that came about from what we understood at the moment to be the projected capital needs of the borough. And as I said earlier, if from additional input from outside third-party experts, we come to a different number every year, then this changes.
Because right now, I think it's primarily based on about 3.5. If we ever got to the number Bruce originally gave us, which is 4, it's going to have to go over 13.
Correct.
And that's why I was almost wondering, is there really a reason why we need a maximum or a range as opposed to just we shouldn't be spending less than this amount? Because that's really where we fell down in the past, where we dropped it to 0 or close to 0.
This could certainly be framed as no less than 10%.
Okay.
And again, it's
If there's
the,
an interest in doing that, it's done.
the funding is no less than, but you could have, let's say at the $3 million a year, you could spend $2 million one year and $4 million the next year because you transferred the $3 million each time, because that's the way the projects fell. Carmel?
Yeah, just a question. Sets aside regular and consistent amounts for aging infrastructure. I totally agree with that, just that one sentence. Absolutely, positively. I'm just wondering how that's going to affect us in 2016, because at this point, we don't really know exactly. We don't have defined reports that tells us what the from the departments that can tell us exactly what's needed. Okay. One of the things that we're working with at the joint meeting right now is, some of the units that have to be replaced, because we have talk about aging infrastructure that was built in 1915, and there's a lot of equipment down there that's really going to be coming, due. But I'm just wondering how we would do that in 2016 without having the information that we need about what exactly we should be planning for. I mean, we just can't say, okay, well, we'll take $2 million.
Well, I think part of it goes back to the transfer happens to fund the planning that may go on. So you make sure you transfer that 10%. Hopefully I'm not speaking out of turn. But, as you start formalizing plans, you at least you've been building this fund up to take care of those big ticket items.
Yeah, well, I understand that, but supposing we really need 13.
And we do 13. Then we do
So-
13, and we add some explaining
In
to
other
it.
words, what we're going to do is we're going to...
And if you need 14, you do 14. And you say why. And if there's a reason that your colleagues agree to, then it's 14.
And I've heard some of the comments that it's the bottom that is making sure we don't go below 10 is more concerning than how high. Right.
Yeah, we take that comment. And
But, Carmela made an interesting point that I don't think we've thought about and maybe we'll have to take this offline to refine this, but to the extent that there are capital needs in the joint meeting, I think our work had assumed that would flow through the joint meeting line and not out of the capital improvement fund. But if that's not correct, we may have to think about that.
That is correct.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's obviously too.
Move on?
Yep. I think we're. Yep.
There are two for property taxes. The first is the substantive one. The second is more mechanical. The first is, and again, there are no numbers in this. It's really kind of a guiding principle as opposed to a guideline. Maintain property taxes at prudent levels after considering what's happening to the cost side of the budget, and what's happening to the revenue side with respect to non-tax revenues. Property taxes, as we all know, is an important part of the budget. I've shown what the numbers are, both in terms of average and in terms of the range. And I think this guideline really just encourages that there be a balanced approach to raising revenue. So if we need to raise revenue as a town, let's raise it in a balanced way and talk about it. Let's not overstress one or the other item. Second property tax is, again, it's a maintenance concept. Maintain the reserve fund collected taxes at its current 2.63%. That's just the math of the current reserve to about $60 million of taxes that are collected. It's based on the one hand, our collection history, but also on the reality that this is one of the key ways that the town generates surplus for the coming years. And so it was a very strong feeling of the administration that we maintain the reserve at the historic levels. Questions or comments on property taxes?
Pat? You're running out of buzzes. Sorry.
No, I get all I want.
Only kidding.
This is obviously one of the areas where you changed. Originally, aspirationally, you had said property taxes should constitute at least 50% of appropriations, I believe. And I know that was taken out. That is something I've obviously felt strongly about for a while. I do feel property taxes give us a more stable revenue source. I think you even mentioned in here that a no increase approach to property taxes is unsustainable. So is under collecting taxes and relying more and more on the electric utility, which I think we have done at times. I would have liked to have seen that stay in here. I also think it's not going to be achievable that we meet some of these other goals, like getting the utility transfer down to a lower level, unless the number comes out of the property tax lines, because I don't really see us generating much revenue in any other place. So, my personal preference would have been for that line to stay in here.
Rob, and then Ben.
No, go ahead. You first.
Yeah, so my biggest concern with the whole thing is that even though the rates we pay are not necessarily reflective of the input cost, electric rates are almost at zero, for lack of a better word, right? In terms of what we pay per kilowatt hour on wholesale. So we are enjoying a massive surplus. We cannot count on that in the future for a variety of reasons that we don't need to go into now. But, I've always felt strongly that we need to shift the balance more away from the utility to property taxes for a variety of reasons. Number one, and I may be wrong, but my sort of, back of the envelope calculations brings me to the conclusion that the reason we had those big problems in 9, 10, 11 were because maybe we had gotten too accustomed to drawing down from the electric utility to fund operating, and we couldn't do that anymore when we locked in at those bad rates. And I don't want to see that happen again, so it had the ripple effect where we didn't. So I too would like to see that stay a little bit higher, just because, if we were sitting somewhere in the middle of the of the distribution of what we pay for input prices, sure, maybe we can be a little bit more liberal on this. But here we are at the very left end of the distribution, and you guys are familiar with chi-squared and log normal distributions, and we know that that our input prices can't go below zero, right? They can in intraday, but we will never pay zero or less for them. And I think right now we're paying 4 cents a kilowatt hour. We don't want to load the boat being short that, because the pain is so much worse to the top side. And I'm sorry for talking like a trader.
No, quite the contrary.
So anything we can do to keep that property tax, higher in the mix, I would support. Is that fair?
Yeah, sure. I was just going to add that it's exactly that type of conversation that we would hope these guidelines would promote. The reason we backed away from specific guideline numbers in this case was there was a sense on the part of some of us that having a threshold number would be a great thing, like 50% or more, and some of us felt it was sufficient to just say that there should be a reasonable balance and not take from the council any discretion whatsoever regarding where property taxes go. So I would say this is the Goldilocks guideline in that sense.
Yeah.
The conversation you just had, which, by the way, I agree with, is very much in the type of conversation that we design these guidelines to promote.
And since the guidelines are supposed to generate conversation, does this council want to put that 50% back in so at least there's a conversation? That's, I think, kind of the question, at least from my mind.
That is a council question. That is not for us.
Yeah, right. Pat, you had your...
I was going to say yes. But again, I still go back to, I think when we're finished with this, I would expect that next year's budget committee would start with these guidelines and hand them to the administration and say, we're looking to make this, and this is the type of goal, guideline, whatever you want to call it, that we might not be able to achieve in 1 year, but we want to see a plan where we get there in 2 or 3 years. And so by putting it in and making it an aspiration, we move towards it as opposed to, the rest of the language, as you say, is not that hard. It's just a lot of information, but it doesn't really move us in any one direction or another in this particular area. In fact, in some respects, it's nice, but it's not really a guideline, with all due respect.
Oh, well taken.
Okay.
It's just that, property taxes become such a heated topic.
I understand. It's a
That
heresy.
we just felt that putting a guideline on paper that we wanted the entire council to endorse would be, in effect, arguing over that issue well in advance of the next budget cycle.
Right.
And that wasn't our intent.
Well, again, I go back to, again, when the whole council sees the budget for the first time, the administration's been working on it for quite a bit of time. So I really view these as kind of guidelines for them as to what they're going to come back to us. So we're not telling them in January or February, oh, by the way, we really were serious about that conversation we had back in June, but we didn't formalize it here. So therefore, you guys kind of went off, and now we'd like you to try to move in that direction at this point in time. It gets to be harder for them. It's easier if we tell them now, so as they go through the fall and start working on next year's budget, they have our guidance, one way or the other. I may not be in the majority.
So quick. Do we want do we want that 50% threshold back in there, or are we comfortable where it is? Just quick straw poll.
No,
Yep. No. All right.
What's the result?
It doesn't seem like a whole lot. I think they're happy with what.
Okay.
The last guideline is the reports, and this speaks to, I think, a little bit what you were saying, Pat, is that for every budget, there'd be 3 sets of reports. There'd be a 5-year look back there versus the guidelines. There'd be a current analysis of the current budget, and then there'd be a budget or brief or something similar for the next 3 years. And so to the extent that you were deviating from one or more of the guidelines, you could start addressing it in the budget and briefs for the next 3 years. That's all on this guideline.
All right. Pat?
Well, somebody else want to go first?
No, but I'm trying to
You're saying it all for us, don't worry.
Go ahead, Pat.
Yes, I'm giving you my constant feedback. And I keep thinking of things. So, I appreciate all the reports. There were a couple others I think, we should also start to do a better job of talking about how much we substitute the electric utility and, to a lesser extent, the water utility surplus for property taxes. But I think more importantly, and we've talked about it a lot here, which is surplus generation, we don't really get a good understanding of where the surplus is coming from year to year, or how we plan to replenish it in the given budget, or to what, where we think we're going to be at the end of the year. I think that's something we really, as a council, need a better handle on as we go forward.
We have been projecting surplus. Oh?
Do we have a surplus projection for this year?
Yep. Yes. Yeah.
I don't remember saying it. Okay, thank you. Yeah. Only because, our budget has a lot of stuff in it it's not the real numbers. Thank you.
But to conclude with some visuals that kind of bring everything together, this is the Budget Committee's alternative budget format, just to reorient everybody. We put appropriations first and then revenues because we think spending drives the budget. And then we differentiate between operations and capital. A number of the guidelines relate to the drivers of the utility surplus. And so the things that are highlighted in red is what creates the need for the utility transfers. The operating shortfall that we spoke about, and the capital improvement fund and the debt service. The other guidelines are important line items that kind of drill down into what's behind the operating shortfall. And so we'll look at the taxes, both the reserve and what we raise from the property taxpayers, how much we bring in from the surplus account. And then I think we also want to look at utility transfers from the other way around, which is what can the utilities provide? I'll end with bringing us back to where we started. That if we have a culture with these 4 financial principles, if we adopt, if not these guidelines, something very, very similar, we'll have a good foundation for some very healthy debate. And that will give the administration and the council an awful lot of good material to have some very, very robust discussions about. And I think that that will just make our current sound practices even better. So, thank you very much.
Art, excellent job in presenting. Council, any closing comments or questions as far as, so the next steps, as we've been talking about, is coming back with a resolution that recognizes this is I'm going to go to the public in a second. Yeah. Best practices guideline that generates discussion but not binds current or future councils. And I think that's where we are, right?
Right.
The only change we'll make is the one we had with regard to capital.
Yes.
Greater than 10% or more.
No less than 10.
No less than 10.
Right. So at this point, I'll open up to the public. If anyone that has questions or comments, usual rules take effect. It'll be the 3 minutes. If you have questions, we'll capture them all, and we'll I know you're anxious, Martin. Just let me get through the rules here. We'll capture all the questions and answer them all at once. Man in the front row, Martin. Perfect.
Martin Barbados, 6 Arlena Court. I'm going to speak quickly because I only have 3 minutes and there's so much to cover. First off, I absolutely support these guidelines. I support them not only as someone that worked with Tom on them, I support them as a chair of the Utilities Planning Committee, but I also support them as someone that had designed guidelines that were followed for approximately 10 years. It's interesting, the study period was for 20 years. 1994 to about 2004, there were guidelines that were followed. They fell out of favor. There was success for 10 years. Then for 10 years, there was not success. And now we've seen again that there is value in them. If the history doesn't tell us anything, it should tell us that it is good to adopt them because then they get held on to. And I wholeheartly support them. I also support the idea that they be tested and verified for continuing use. Interestingly enough, they align with some of the past ones, and that's why I like them as well. We had, at the time, a limit on municipal surplus that we talked about was 25%. Yours is more generous. It looks at 20 to 25%. We tried to align utility transfer with capital and wean ourselves off of using it for operation expenses. You've done the same thing with using a 7% rate, which limits the operating surplus, the operating shortfall use of utility surplus. So I really strongly encourage the council to adopt these, give them time to work, test them, revise them as you see fit. Having said that, I would propose areas for further study, which could be areas for enhancement. I'm more than happy to work with the committee on them. First off, more should be done on the mix of revenues to maximize the benefit of the taxpayers. There's 3 basic revenue sources that make up about 90% of the revenue. It's property taxes, utility transfer, and municipal sources. They should be looked at more independently. I'm with the committee on what I'll call, and I don't mean it dismissively the kind of siloed numbers of the percentages per each. But there was some interesting conversation that the council had talked about is that, well, what happens under these circumstances? And it's a great question. And part of the answer is that these should be looked at independently, and it should be looked at more as a portfolio approach of the three rather than the individuals. I would suggest, and as I said, I'm more than happy to work with you on it. Pat, I think, touched on this, and maybe some others, is that it assumes that the period studied is the guideline, yes, as far as it goes, and we should be careful to look at that history too to see if everything worked during that period of time that we're using for the purposes of setting the guideline. There may be things that didn't work. I think more can be done on expense guidelines. For instance, when we had done it in the past, what we had was a control on overall expenditures, which was a price deflator, using the state price deflator as a guideline on spending. I don't think that we can successfully just rely upon the statutory caps. A couple of the other things that were mentioned, Rob, you had mentioned about not counting on surplus. Again, I think that the guidelines kind of don't do that. They work towards not doing that by limiting the 7% for appropriations with regard to shortfall. That helps control the amount of surplus that's used in operations. I think it's a good first step. Again, what we tried to do, we're talking about, is weaning ourselves entirely off of it and aligning all surplus with capital expenditures, because you have an idea of that the surplus is less fixed revenue and you're aligning it with a more adjustable spend than you would with operating expenses. But I think it's a good first step, and I would totally support it. This was another one mentioned about work on controlling the size of the utility surplus. We did. When I say we, I mean Tom and Ben and myself did do some preliminary work on an approach to managing the size of the surplus within the utility for the purposes that you're talking about. And there was an idea of banking some of it, but there shouldn't be an overall overcreation of it. But one of the major controls you have of that is really rates. And so every year, as you see what that surplus is generating, it's a way to look at rates. And it's the last thing I said, and I apologize that these were a little out of order, but I was trying to put it together here, is that an underlying assumption of the guidelines that we have to be very careful about is that they assume the current rates. They assume current electric rates and assume current water rates. And once we have the utility presentation, and as you know, I assume that that's what we're going to do again, and we did back in January, there was a suggestion that the rates may be above market. If you adopt a mission that says that the rates should be closer to market, and then you adjusted rates, that may have an impact on some of this, some of the guidelines. But again, that gets back to the point I said earlier, is that we need to be careful about not being too siloed about it and being more interdependent in the analysis and the presentation of it. But I think it's a great effort. I'm very happy to see what the Budget Committee's done, and I wholeheartedly support its adoption.
Thank you. Anyone else wishing to comment or ask questions on budget guidelines? Seeing none, I close the public part of the discussion, and we have no ordinances for hearing, so we go to invitation for discussion. So this is another opportunity for the public to comment on anything. Again, please step up, state your name, your address, and keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. Anyone wishing to be heard? Seeing none, close this part of the meeting. And we have no introduction of ordinances. Consent agenda resolutions. Will the clerk please read the statement?
Consent agenda resolutions will be enacted with a single motion. Any resolution requiring expenditure is supported by a certification of availability of funds. Any resolution requiring discussion will be removed from the consent agenda. All resolutions will be reflected in full in the minutes.
Mayor, I move consent agenda resolutions R166 through R175.
Second. Yeah.
Council discussion?
175? Yeah. I would like to hold that 175.
All right, so we'll move consent 166 through 174, and we'll move 175 separately. So revise your motion.
Yes, my motion is so revised.
Second?
So seconded.
Any further discussion? Roll call vote, please.
Mr. Catalanello?
Yes.
Mr. Landrigan?
Yes.
Mrs. Vitale?
Yes.
Ms. Bailey?
Yes, to all but R 174, I have to recuse myself.
Mr. Wolkowitz?
Yes.
And Mr. Rowe?
Yes.
Okay, motion for 175, please. Ostrey?
Oh, so moved. I move 175 for discussion.
So, I second for discussion.
Okay, and council discussion. Rob?
Thank you. So, under this ordinance,
Or resolution.
pardon me, resolution, sorry it's late, I have a question pertaining to Section D, responsibility. The first point says, all media communication activity representing the borough must be authorized by the borough administrator or assistant borough administrator. The establishment of social media pages and sites must be based on clear business need that is not served by the borough's existing social media platform. I have no problem or issue with the second sentence. On the first sentence, though, my question is, how does that relate to the statutory requirements for the chief of police, I guess under Title 40A, Section 118, and I can also imagine a situation where, and let's again take it to the extreme, we have some sort of an emergency in town. The police want to send a nixle. One of these two is on vacation, the other one's in the shower. Could happen. How do we get around wasting, alerting the public to potential danger where precious minutes could literally mean life or death?
Matt, you want?
Well, first, this is all media communication activity. It doesn't mean all communication. So I think that if every bit of communication that was going out of the police department had to be approved by Jim or Ray, that would prove difficult. This is the activity and how you're going to go about communicating it. So, for example, the chief of police could easily go to Jim and or Ray and say, we have our police blotters. We want to be able to post it on not just the Madison Eagle. We want to also disclose it on our website. If there's an emergency, the OEM and the chief will use Nixle. What you want to do is you want to have clear, established paths of how you're going to communicate. What would become very disruptive, and I think would be a true public disservice, is if you let every department have their own websites, have their own means of communication. This isn't controlling what's going out communication-wise. It's you're going to have one source of it. What we've also done is there's a department liaison for every department, so that you guys can control ultimately, because it is the Borough of Madison and it's communication on behalf of the borough. So that you have one area that people can go to get communications, one site or official sites that they can access, and finally, if you have a situation where you do have a department head who is misusing it or using it for wrong purposes, you have the ability to intervene and say, you have to use it for official business. And that's what this is for. If the second sentence is the establishment of social media pages and sites must be,
Totally.
So I think that what you're referring to is 40A 14118, which is known as the Police Chief's Powers Act, where they run the day-to-day operations of the police department. The day-to-day operations of the police department is not setting up websites or creating things.
No, my issue is not with the setting up of a website or anything like that. It's the actual communication to the public. Right?
They have the right to communicate. We're not infringing upon that. And we cite later on that there are nothing in this foregoing provisions are supposed to interfere with law, etc. This is a policy that we put in the handbook so that people are guided accordingly, so that they know that they're using it appropriately, they're not setting up their own websites, and that there's one voice that we speak with. Can policies be tweaked? They can absolutely be tweaked, but the purpose of this is not to infringe whatsoever on day-to-day operations. It's so that there's one clear message, so that we don't have to be monitoring it. Because the one thing I can tell you is, and you've seen it recently, where people, employees, utilize websites or social media in inappropriate fashions. And we want to make sure that whoever's utilizing our website, our media, our Nixle, is being run through filters, or we have the ability to get onto it and say this is not appropriate and address it.
Yeah, I have no problem with the media policy for the borough. My main concern and my question is, would that interfere with the routine day-to-day
can jump.
operations of the chief? Not of like rank and file officers, not of people.
No, and I think that the chief would be the designee for that department.
Yeah, so let's say, for example, it says right here, the borough administrator will provide guidance and will oversee coordination. It doesn't say we're going to authorize or approve every nixle. So I would imagine that a policy would be set if it's an emergent nixle and it's evening or weekend and no one's around, that the dispatcher, which in some cases can happen, can send out a nixle. But there was a nixle that happened last week that a staff person spoke to the dispatcher issued a nixle that was incorrect. Ray was in his office. Had the dispatcher, had that police staff person spoken to Ray, he could have said, wait a minute, don't send that out. That doesn't sound right. Let me check in on it. And then an inadvertent nixle wouldn't have gone out. So it's there to protect on both sides, but in an emergent situation where no one's available or it's truly emergent, clearly they can go ahead
Or
and
the other example was yesterday, which the missing elderly gentleman. That would have gone. That's the emergency situation, and that would not have had to go through a filter because it is something that needs to be dealt with immediately. Where an announcement of a.
So who's going to set up the filters then?
Ray and I will talk to the chief about the various, define an emergency and go ahead and do it, and then we'll manage situations when it becomes when it's on the line. When it's is this something that can wait 5 minutes? And I think. What the mayor said, that's something that shouldn't wait 5 minutes. I think the question on the nixle that went out last week probably could have waited 5 minutes.
Does it make sense to talk to the chief before we pass this ordinance?
Well, I mean, what I would tell you, this is an ordinance. This is a
Resolution.
resolution.
Sorry,
And the resolution
Sorry, I'm
is,
just,
resolution is
tired.
merely to include this in your employee handbook. I'm a firm believer, it's better to have something than nothing. Can we refine this after you guys work with it? Will the chief have potential ideas? Yes. But right now, I think it's important for you guys to have something because this has two parts. It's that you, the borough, establish your communication devices, but it also has an entire part about personal social media use. And while people have First Amendment rights, when you're a public employee, there are, perfect example, you had the tragic death late last week of a trooper. A trooper was with a deer on 195 and he died. A law clerk decided to go on private social media and make comments about it. She was Monday morning suspended without pay and she's no longer a law clerk. So I think it's important for public employees to realize that when they're making comments, people look at them very differently and say, you're a representative of this borough. How dare you say that? And you've had that happen all over the country. So this also gives people guidance, and it's a work in progress. Your employee handbook, what we've done is we've created it so that it's easily amended by resolution as opposed to ordinance. That way, if things come up, we can change it with one meeting. And this is something that if the chief, Jim and Ray meet and they say, let's change it this way, we can do it by one simple resolution. But my recommendation would be to have something out there because right now you don't have anything that deals with this issue, and that to me is more frightening than to try to make the perfect policy because, as we all know, this area of the law or this area of the world is, it's revolutionary what's going on, and I think we have to be kind of ahead of the curve for our employees.
Pat?
So a couple quick things. It was kind of unclear to me in terms of some of these groups. So the police department is included. Does this also cover the DDC, the library, and other boards and commissions that are employees of the borough? Okay, so they'll pass everything through. The thing is, have you guys written a procedure or a process for this? Because as soon as this becomes law, they're going to have to pass everything past you. Well, it's going to go in the handbook.
Well, this won't be law. It's a policy, and it'll.
But a policy is a law, and there's a penalty if you don't follow it. So we need to have a procedure in place quickly that defines for people how they're going to get things approved. Like what is emergency, what isn't, and for things that are non-emergency, who's going to be the approver? What's the turnaround? Do you send an email? Do you have to come see Ray? Do you have to call Ray? Just you got to give people guidelines once you tell them that this is going to be the way it works. Okay.
Rob?
So I'll vote against it because I think we should. I think Pat's statement is absolutely correct. We can't give people a new policy without having procedures beforehand. How many times in like work have you been told to do stuff with, it's extremely frustrating, and I think we can spend the next 2 weeks hammering out the procedure, and then you can iron out what is the definition of emergency and not, get buy-in from the chief, and we can pass it at the next meeting. I think I agree 100%. We need a media policy, media relation policy. Everyone has one. But I think in this case we should engage the chief, and we should also have the policies ready before we pass this resolution.
All right.
I guess before we have to vote no or yes, is there any way we could table this for one meeting and come back in 2 weeks so we know there's a process in place? I make a motion that we table
We have a
it.
motion, we'd have
You have
to,
to make a motion to table.
I'll make a motion that we table it.
Second.
There's to be a roll call now on the motion to table.
Ed Lanello, just a motion
There's a
to table?
If there's a motion and a second to initially introduce.
Right.
Now that there's a motion to table under Robert's Rules of Order, you have to vote on the motion to table before you go back to the
Before we go
original.
back
motion.
to
Discussion, though?
Absolutely, you can have a discussion on the motion to table.
yes.
I don't know, I feel that we have a procedure in place. The last time this was introduced, I think it was at the last meeting, Ray said he planned to talk to all the department heads and begin the process of going over these. So this would be, from my perspective, the starting point, and that if they had any comments, let them come back and we can tweak them as
When I talked to Ray on Friday morning, that was one question. I thought he was going to speak to them before this meeting. He said as of Friday he had not talked to anybody, and as far as I know, the department heads are not aware that this policy is being put in place effective this evening.
You need a microphone.
Okay.
At the last two staff meetings, the intent to introduce a draft policy was explained to to the staff members, to the department heads, but they did not see the actual detail that had been prepared by Matt and refined. So the goal was to adopt it tonight. Maybe a compromise could be make it an effective date July 1st, adopt it this evening, but it's not effective July 1st. It gives us from tonight to July 1st to work with the department heads and explain it. The one issue that I can see coming is, Rob has alluded to, the police department feels strongly that they should be independent in terms of that, and that's one of the issues that we have, that we need to have a cohesive, coordinated policy. And I'll use one simple example. I don't know if I want to have a police blotter or press release every week talking about kids that then follows them for the next 20 years of their life when somebody Googles their name. I don't know if that's what the image we want to present for Madison. I'd like to sit with the chief and explain a policy on how we want to go about something like that. The Nixle was a good example. We sent out a Nixle. We're sitting in our offices. We didn't know about it. We knew about the electric issue. Didn't know the Nixle was going out. And then they notified half the town that the power was going to be out for 90 minutes on a day that was pouring rain. The switchboard got bombarded, and nobody was going to be out of power. But everybody who some pump was worried that they were going to get flooded out called the police desk and called our offices. They could have just picked up the phone and said, what's going on? We straightened it out. Then they issued an apology. That shouldn't have happened. And with this policy, hopefully, will stop things like that happening. And that was an important issue, but it wasn't. It could have picked up the phone for 30 seconds and say, hey, we have this issue. The other is the way they nix all our residents occasionally. It's like when we have a power outage, I don't want to have a nixle going out saying, don't call the police desk. We know about the electric. It should be, we're aware of the emergency, crews are on their way, service should be restored promptly. Something of that message. I just think it's the protocol, how we work with them, and Matt alluded to it. We'll sit down with the police department, get an appropriate person who's going to be in charge of these type of situations, work on the protocol with the chief, train the staff who's going to be doing these messages, and they have to be sensitive to the receiver. And we shouldn't be sending nickels out at 3 o'clock in the morning about a bear sighting. Things like that. Just common sense things just seem to kind of fall through the cracks. That's the purpose.
So with the training in place, we get to the point where someone that's trained doesn't have to get approval because they know how to do it. There might be some feedback saying that message you sent out yesterday was borderline. This is how you should have done it. So, yeah.
We should be telling our residents, stop calling the police desk. To me, we should be more affirmative. We're aware of the emergency. Crews are on their way.
Yep.
Just a style, and I think we could work through those.
Austri?
So I think these guidelines, if we pass them tonight, gives the administrator and the assistant administrator a means of talking, as something substantive to talk to with their department heads. So
Well,
and this can be tweaked.
I'd be happy if we delayed it just so we could get a process in place and we can inform everybody. But because effective, I mean, the way I understand a resolution, when does it become effective? As soon as we pass it?
When you pass it.
Okay, so 1 minute after this meeting ends, technically people, they even have to be informed of it for it to be effective?
Well, of course, you'd have to put it in you'd have to disseminate it. You'd
Okay.
have to notify them of it because you've got a handbook. It's going to be part of the handbook.
So if we made this effective July 1st, I'd be happy to approve this tonight. It would give everybody the time to be aware of it, get some feedback. I like the idea that there are sort of canned messages that you'd send, kind of will agree to, in terms of, street closings, emergencies with the electric department. This way, it's not left to the discretion of who's ever sitting at the desk. It also would make it faster for them. They just pull up message 37 and shoot it off. We
Right.
do that in general in IT on a regular basis.
So right now, we have the motion to table. If it is not tabled, then we can revise the motion to, the original motion to include the implementation of July 1. Okay.
I like that better.
So first, we're going to vote on,
You've made the motion to table.
You can withdraw it.
You could the motion to withdraw, so you could withdraw your motion to table,
Yeah.
and then we could amend the previous motion to have an effective date of July 1.
So we're in agreement that we'll make it effective July 1. Then I will withdraw my tabling motion. Somebody has to second.
I'm going to second.
Okay. Now there'll be a motion to amend the original motion with an effective date of July 1 for the implementation of this policy.
So moved.
Second.
any further discussion?
Yes. I'm sorry.
Yeah, we're going to go Carmella first and then Rob.
Very quick, I promise.
Getting back to your point, okay, let's just say this. It's amended for July the 1st to include a procedure of how it goes. That should really take care of this.
That's what she just
And
moved, and I seconded.
I think just,
You only said July 1st.
I read
This resolution.
Yeah, don't,
I apologize. I just wanted to, I've read a lot of the different policies, in municipal governments throughout, not in New Jersey, but throughout many, many states when putting this together. And my sense is to develop the protocol, really what it should be is you're going to put out where each department will have a head. So you'll have the Department of Health, you'll have the Police Department, you'll have Public Works. Those key stakeholders should get together with Ray and Jim to develop the protocols because they have unique things in their departments as opposed to having a free fall of every town employee, and then they'll go back and disseminate it to whoever their designee
That's
is.
fine, but 3 weeks gives us time
Yep.
to do this in a logical fashion as opposed to tomorrow morning people waking up and finding out that there's a new policy that they have no procedure for even getting something approved.
and to Carmella's point, I don't think we need to revise it because the reason we're postponing it is so that the administration can put this in place. I think that's very clear. Okay, Rob?
Thank you. As it pertains to the nixle about the bears at 3 o'clock in the morning, send me one every night, but don't waste 30 or 45 seconds with a junior person who doesn't understand the policies trying to find someone when there's a guy committing an armed robbery downtown.
Right. Yep. I think.
So that's why we need these policies before we pass this.
Yep.
That's why you need buy-in from the chief. That's all I have to say.
Fair enough. We're ready? Roll call vote?
Can I get a clarification on what we're voting?
The motion is
amended?
175, amended with an effective date of July 1,
Thank you.
2015.
Okay. Roll call is Mr. Catalanello?
Yes.
Mr. Landrigan?
Yes.
Mrs. Vitale?
Yes.
Ms. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Wolkowitz?
Yes.
Mr. Rowe?
Yes. Thank you for a very spirited discussion. That was good. There is no unfinished business. Approval of vouchers.
Public safety, $9,099. Health and public assistance, $1,688.74. Public works and engineering, $98,889.33. Community affairs, $2,437.25. Finance and borough clerk, $4,622,819.78. And utilities, $194,863.77. Total is $4,929,797.87.
Mayor, I move the vouchers.
Second.
Any discussion? Roll call vote.
Mr. Catalonello?
Yes.
Mr. Landrigan?
Yes.
Mrs. Vitale?
Yes.
Ms. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Wolkowitz?
Yes.
Mr. Rowe?
Yes.
Okay, one item under new business. We want to make the following appointments requiring council confirmation. This is for the Borough Board of Education Shared Services Committee. And on the committee, 3 members and 1 alternate. Members, myself, Bob Conley as mayor, Bob Landrigan as council or liaison to the Board of Education, Pat Rowe as at-large, and Carmela Vitale as alternate member. Have a motion
So
to approve
moved.
those?
So moved?
I'll second.
Roll call vote.
Okay, Mr. Catalonello?
Yes.
Mr. Landrigan?
Yes.
Mrs. Vitale?
Yes.
Ms. Bailey?
Yes.
Mr. Wolkowitz?
Yes.
Mr. Rowe?
Yes.
And Mr. Rowe.
And with that, I move we adjourn for the evening.
Thank you all. A very, very good meeting.
Matt, feeling good? I know, I bet.
Back there.
Like success stories.
I'll send you a projector there. Screen on either side.
Okay.